I want to tell you about a band. And this band was in the stage where they were starting to get really popular. And their two main singer-songwriters looked back and they thought about their drummer, always behind the drums, way in the back of the band. And for this particular drummer, he was not much involved except in the drumming. And so they decided they were going to write a special song for this drummer. Well, this drummer had a limited range. You know, maybe he couldn't hit the high notes, maybe he couldn't hit the low notes. And so the drummer needed to have special attention. So they worked really hard on this song, and they came out with a song that they thought if he sung carefully, he could make a go of it. And so anyway, they did it, and after he read it and tried it out, he was happy with it after making a few changes in some of the words, and then they recorded it. All right? I'm going to read the opening lyrics, and I want you to tell me if you know who I'm talking about and what song. What would you think if I sang out of tune? Would you stand up and walk out on me? Okay, the original lyrics was, would you stand up and throw tomatoes at me? Okay, next line, lend me your ears and I'll sing you a song. I'll try not to sing out of key. I get by with a little help from my friends. Going to try with a little help from my friends. So what's the song? Little help from my friends. And what's the group? The Beatles, right. And who's the drummer? Ringo Starr. This was his first hit song. Okay? Now, you got to realize that the Beatles recorded 309 songs and they wrote 237 of them themselves. And Ringo got to sing 10 songs out of that whole repertoire. And we know 2 songs, all right? First one is With a Little Help from My Friends. The second one is Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Heart Club Band. Okay? But here's what it says. And this is Paul McCartney speaking. This was written out at John's house for Ringo. We always like to do one for him, and it had to be not too much like our style. See how diplomatic he's being? He says, I think that was probably the best of the songs we wrote for Ringo, actually. And so, what are we talking about today? We're talking about everyday compassion. And the form of everyday compassion we're talking about is spelled ENCOURAGE. And you could put MENT. To encourage, to give courage in the face of difficulty, adversity, or need. And so, with a little help from our friends, we get by, and every once in a while, that's just enough to keep us going, right? Just enough to keep us from going off the deep end, and we'll be able to bounce back, and we'll be able to move forward. And the great thing about encouragement is its everydayness. Quote marks, because there's no such word, all right? But it's everydayness. You can do this every day, many, many times a day. It's something that we can provide over and over again. It is practical, it is helpful, it is valuable. Let me give you some examples to stimulate our thinking about the times when we need a little help from our friends. Very simple things. I deliberately chose them just to show how practical and common they are. Guys, you ever have to hang up something big and you don't mind trying to hold it and nailing it yourself, but you really needed somebody at the other end to hold up and to help you to keep it straight? Man, it's hard. You can do it alone, but you may have to do it many times. So it's nice to have that kind of help. How about your car is being repaired, and so you drop it off. What do you need? You need a ride back home, right? And my mechanic is in Arcadia. I live in Marina. That's a long ways to hitchhike. Yeah, Perry's out there going like this. I beat you, Perry. Yeah, it is. It could take you all day. Then you need somebody to bring you back the second time, right? And so, simple thing like that. But, it can be more serious. I know a man who lived in Chinatown, and he wanted to get a special treatment that was provided only by Loma Linda University. And he wanted to arrive well-rested, and he didn't want the anxiety of fighting the freeway. Well, that's quite a drive. You see, so the same application can be taken into a different situation. How about this one? You're going out of town, and you have a pet. What do? Right? You need pet sitting. Even if your dog is so house-trained, you need somebody to come over and let him out to do his business, right? Make sure he gets fed so you don't come home to a skeleton. I had a neighbor, she was going out of town, and she says, Ken, can you watch my birds for me? And at that point, she only had one. And these are her singing birds. She says, you don't have to do much with them, I'll bring it over, we keep the cover on, and you just make sure they have enough water and keep it out of the draft because they're very vulnerable to drafts. Well, after 3 days of a 7-day trip, guess what? The bird died. I was humiliated, all right? I think, do I go and find her a replacement bird? I don't even know what this is. She comes back, and I apologize profusely. And she says, oh, don't worry about it. Most of the time, I didn't have anybody to leave my birds with. So whenever I went on vacation, I took them and put them in the oven and gassed them to death. Anyway, and she says, this bird was old, so it wasn't my fault. Okay, but see, you have a pet. You need a little help from your friends. How about you go somewhere and you need a place to stay? My daughter just got a job working up at Google in Silicon Beach. Well, you could be paying $2,000 for a closet. Now, I learned to sleep standing up, but I don't think my daughter ever did that. Okay? But fortunately, she had a couple of friends up there who owned a house. And so she's living there until December for free. Pretty good, huh? But we've been in those situations where we needed a place to crash. Very simple thing, but very important. Or you're going to see the doctor, and you're going to hear something very, very scary. And you don't want to go alone. And you just want somebody there sitting next to you. A little help from your friends. Or single people. They don't want to go to the Lamaze class alone. They got to find a partner. Somebody to bring along. A guy, a girl, it doesn't matter. Just somebody, a little help from a friend. I found that, even these are very commonplace. They can have extreme impact. They can have impact far beyond what you can imagine. I've seen we're walking together with somebody so that they can get air, sunshine, and energy is helpful. It's helpful because that person is going through depression. This person is the head of a department of a major hospital, and he needs time for his medications potency to build up in his system before it's going to really take effect. And just going out and walking together is very, very helpful. Another case, a person is going through a divorce, and he's responsible for one of the largest Asian import companies in America. And all of this is immobilizing him, draining him of his willpower. Solution? somebody plays racquetball with him. You ever play racquetball? Now that's one intense sport, okay? You got to be careful. You got to be darting back and forth over that thing. That ball is coming so fast, and if you're not careful, you get whacked by that other, you could lose an eye by the other racket. And yet, that's the kind of intensity that provides a mental break so that he can kind of go into a rest and be able to come out and be ready to continue his responsibilities. I can think of examples of regular breakfasts for support, driving a dying person to his favorite places for nostalgia, to sweeten up his final days, accompanying and escorting people on the Access paratransit, all kinds of different ways. And anybody can do it. No need for special training, no need for any Googling of how to do it. You just get in there and you will be able to make a profound difference. Well, at the beginning of the church, God highlighted very specifically this kind of compassion, this thing we called encouragement. And he focused in on one particular person. His name is Barnabas, and his story is spread out throughout the book of Acts. He comes, and then he disappears, and then he reappears. But each time he reappears, it's the same guy. There is a consistency of the spotlight that God is putting him in. So if you turn with me to Acts chapter 4, and we're going to begin with the first entry about Barnabas. Acts 4:36 and 37. And we just finished a paragraph talking about how great the church was doing and how everybody was supportive of one another. And then one guy is singled out. And let's read this together. It says, "Thus Joseph, who was also called by the apostles Barnabas, which means son of encouragement, a Levite, a native of Cyprus, sold a field that belonged to him and brought the money and laid it at the apostles' feet." Now, he wasn't the only one doing this, but he was the one who was doing it on a consistent basis, and the Bible wanted to point him out for some special thing. And in verse 36, it gives his name. His name is Joseph. And if I had said Joseph, most of you would not have remembered who I was talking about, because we all know him by his nickname, Barnabas. Now, what does it mean? Son of encouragement. Now, I don't know if you guys had nicknames growing up. I had one that dogged me through my whole elementary years. Okay? That name was Fisherman. Yeah, they called me Fisherman, Daniel. I'll tell you why they called me Fisherman. So we're immigrants, and we landed in America, and I was getting people's hand-me-down clothes. All right? And so one person donated a rain hat, and it was a rain hat that commercial fishermen used to wear in those days with the long back bill. So I'm, in my whole elementary school, the only kid wearing one of these hats. And of course, the rest of the kids thought that was hilarious. I didn't think it was so funny, but they thought it was hilarious. And I never got rid of that thing until I was in junior high school. No, I would have preferred a nickname like Magic. But that doesn't happen very often, does it? Well, here is a good nickname. And, it was so much him that we have forgotten who Joseph was. Well, it says Joseph was a Cyprian Levite. Now, you remember the Levites In the Old Testament, God set them aside and says, you guys are special. I want you guys to be the ones in charge of the temple. Okay? And you're going to rotate in, and you're going to live in it, and you're going to be a very special people for me. But because he was a Cyprian Levite, he wasn't allowed to by the local Levites. Okay? Now, he could have been angry about that, and he could have pouted and everything, but no. You see him start off, he's making a donation, and he's showing that he has a compassion for whom? For the poor and the needy of the church. Because at that time, many in the church came from the slave class. Okay? And you're talking about, in those days, several layers of slaves. And you can go down to the poorest of the slaves, and these people the church was providing for. And so he, instead of staying with his Levite status, instead of keeping himself excluded as a Cyprian, he comes alongside of these poor people of all sorts, and he provides them. And so it makes such an impression, not just this act, but because of the many things that they give him the name Son of Encouragement. Now, literally, the word there in encouragement, the Greek, is parakaleo. That's made up of two words. Para says alongside, next to. Kaleo is the word for call. And you put it together, and the idea is you called alongside. And so this is his method. This is his simple beginning point when he does the work of encouragement. And this word has come to have a lot of different connotations, and they give it a lot of English translations. It's translated encourage, to counsel, to help, to comfort, to advocate. And so there's all of these things. Well, guess who else in the Bible has this nickname? Jesus gives the same nickname to the Holy Spirit. How about that? John 14 in verses 16 and 26. We won't talk about it, look at it specifically, but Jesus says, I am going to send you another comforter, another one to come alongside, to encourage and to help you as you go forward without me. He says the Father will send a comforter, and he will show you our love and develop your love. You see, because remember last week we said in Galatians chapter 5, God says, be led by the Spirit, walk with the Spirit, keep in step with the Spirit. And after that, the first thing the Spirit develops in us, in the fruit of the Spirit, is what? Love. And so, by keeping in step with the one who has come alongside of us, and we coming alongside of others, he develops love in our hearts. And we can be those who can practice encouragement. I like to call encouragement compassion light, L-I-T-E. Okay, some of you know that's the word they use for beer when they take out the calories, all right? Because, this is easy. This is very natural. This is not the kind of thing like some of the things we've talked about in past sermons. Well, so we've seen Barnabas come alongside the poor of his church. Now, let's look at the next time he appears, and he doesn't appear until several chapters later in Acts chapter 9. And this time, he is going to come alongside an individual. This time, he's going to have to get personally involved. He doesn't just make a donation and say, here, you fellas take care of it. And the person he's going to come alongside of, his name is Saul. Later on, his name becomes Paul. But at the time when Barnabas comes alongside, Saul's just been converted. But you know what? They don't trust him. They don't believe him. They're thinking, what is, if this is a trap? And so I can see the early church and the early Christians struggling. Do I trust or don't I trust? Right? And we've all had that situation. Do I believe or do we not believe? And so they were paralyzed. They were paralyzed. They didn't know what to do. And so Acts 9:27 and 28 describes his process. And it's very short, not much. It says 27. Okay, that's the part about the people not believing him, not believing Saul. And 27 says, but Barnabas, all by himself, all on his own, but Barnabas took Saul and brought him to the apostles and declared to them how on the road Saul had seen the Lord who spoke to Saul, and how at Damascus he had preached boldly in the name of Jesus. And so what Barnabas had to do was he had to take a big risk to come alongside this guy who had been the fear killers of the Christians. And he had to set aside his fears. He had to set aside also the possibility that not everybody wants him to do this. I mean, over and over, one of the natural things is you want to step out and reach out to people that others don't trust. It might have happened in your family. And guess what? When you reach out, all the rest of them will say, don't do it. If you do it, I'm going to be angry. I may retaliate. You see, he was taking a risk on himself about his relationship with the rest of the Christians in the church. I remember when my parents wanted to do something. They wanted to go to the immigration service and say, hey, guess what? We're here under false pretenses. We're illegal. Well, my mom wanted to do it so that she could bring other families over. But the rest of the family thought, no, they're going to deport us all. And boy, she caught it from the rest of the family. And see, you can see where Saul could, bring this same thing on Barnabas. But instead, he takes the time and effort. He finds out the history of the man, and he finally is able to tell him his background and give convincing proof that this guy is the real product. And so they accept him in the next verse, which you just had up there, verse 28, I'll just say it. And so Saul went in and out among them at Jerusalem, preaching boldly in the name of the Lord. So we see the good results. And we see why the apostles gave him the nickname Barnabas. He just had a knack for coming alongside. Well, once again, he disappears. But in chapter 11, Barnabas reappears again, pops up. Because what has happened is, in a city far away called Antioch, a church has just kind of sprouted up. Okay? This was not a church plant from Jerusalem. And it was starting to get big. And so the leaders at Jerusalem says, we don't know about these guys. We better check them out. Especially they're in the Greek part of the world. And so they're not like us in Jerusalem. And we got to make sure they're on the right track. Who shall we send? Well, you know what? We had a guy who already did that once. Barnabas. Let's send Barney. He wasn't afraid to go and approach Saul. And he did the homework. And look at the good results. And so, in verse 22 of chapter 11, it says, the report of this church in Antioch came to the ears of the church in Jerusalem, and they sent Barnabas to Antioch. And he comes alongside, and he decides that they can be trusted. And then in verse 23, this is what he does. He not only investigates, but he really comes alongside. He doesn't stay separate like, I'm from Jerusalem. He transfers his membership and becomes a part of Antioch. And he starts off and he says, when he came and he saw the grace of God, he was glad and he exhorted the Christians at Antioch all to remain faithful to the Lord with steadfast purpose. Now there's a word in that verse that I mentioned earlier, and I want to see who's the most awake person in this room. Which word did I mention earlier? And I don't mean God. The word exhorted. And that is the translation of which Greek word? Parakaleo, paraklesis. He again encouraged them, comforted them, exhorted them. And they're searching for the right context for it. But again, he's being so consistent. And verse 24 says, a great many were added to the church. Well, what does he do next? He says, I am going to take responsibility for what's happening. I'm going to help in what way I can. And so he realizes the church is getting big, and he's just a layperson, right? So in verse 25, he acts on an idea. It says in verse 25, he goes to Tarsus to look for somebody who was trained. Pharisee of the Pharisees with a PhD from Jerusalem's Harvard. He says, this guy can help the church. And so he goes over there and he calls them, and you know what? He not only becomes a blessing and encouragement to Saul because he's stuck on the back burner, takes him out, gives him a ministry that he can sink his teeth into. But he also blesses the church and affirms the church on his own initiative. And because he knows what it means to operate in a Christian church and in a Christian setting, he is able to spend the next year working with Saul to develop him to know how to do things different than in the temple. And so he becomes a very effective Christian worker. I remember my first year of college, and the junior Sunday school teacher said, Ken, you and your friends are college students now. We need you to be Sunday school teachers. Okay. What do? You teach. Who? You can teach my junior boys. I said, okay, how? Here's the Sunday school quarterly. You take it, you read it, and you come teach next Sunday. That was it. And that shows the two extremes weaknesses of what we do in the church. We find somebody who's young, innocent, and gullible, and we dump it on him. And we run. And he never hears from us again. That's a sure way to burn out good young workers. And we do it constantly. The other way is to overly micromanage. I grew up in a church where the pastor didn't want to baptize me. And I said, why? And he says, you're not ready yet. And I found out, guess what? People who had served with him in the church for 20 years as his treasurers were still considered not ready. You're never going to be allowed to take on the ministry and to try to take the ball and run with it. You see the two extremes, and we got to find that middle ground where you work with people and you give them not only your knowledge, not only your skills, not only your help, but your love, because that's probably the most essential thing. And so that's what he does. And their partnership develops so nicely that God looks down and says, you know what? This is an effective team. I'm going to use them to be my first set of missionaries throughout the Mediterranean. And as a result, they plant a string of churches. Well, the last time he comes alongside, shown in Scripture, is with a young fellow called John Mark. And I'm going to speed it up a little bit. He's come alongside a church. He's come alongside of somebody who's distrusted, an outsider. He's come out with people who are different class. He's come alongside of people who are new and different and supported them. He's come alongside and recovered talent that was wasting, on the vine. Now he comes alongside John Mark. And John Mark is a young fellow that he and Paul take on that first missionary trip. But what happens is he leaves them, John Mark. Maybe things got too hard. He got homesick. He couldn't handle the food. He couldn't handle the ocean voyages, whatever. But he leaves them and he cuts out. And then later on, it's time to start the new second trip. Paul says we should make a follow-up trip. By now, the Bible stops calling him Saul and starts to call him Paul. And he says, all right, let's go back to the church that we visited. And Barnabas says, yeah, that's a great idea. And then the problem starts in verse 37 of Acts 15. It says, Barnabas wanted to take with him John called Mark. But Paul thought best not to take with them one who had withdrawn from them in Pamphylia and had not gone with them to the work. And there arose a sharp disagreement so that they separated from each other. Barnabas took Mark with him and sailed away to Cyprus. And so what was going to be one trip became two trips, and they were able to do the results twice as quickly. And this is 3 years later, but Paul is still angry about what happened, and he says to Barnabas, no way, Jose, you're not bringing him along. And so what happens is Barnabas takes Mark, and if he can take a guy like Saul and develop him, you think he can take a guy like John Mark and develop him? Some young guy, wet behind the ears. He does a great job. And at the end, Paul is asking for John Mark to come and help him while he is in prison. Paul, on the other hand, will continue to lose people along the way. He's probably a kind of a hard-driving kind of a guy not everybody can work for, kind of like a Steve Jobs. Anyway, here's what happens. Barnabas wasn't an apostle. He comes and goes. He's just a layman, but he was available to God. He was just a simple encourager. But along the way, we find in these passages that he was pivotal in moving and changing the direction of the church. And by the time you step back and you get the whole big picture, you realize that Barnabas and Paul planted all the churches around the Mediterranean. And the guys that Barnabas mentored, Paul, John Mark. Mark is the author of the Gospel of Mark. And scholars think that this is the foundation for Luke's Gospel and Matthew's Gospel. And then you talk about Paul, out of the 27 books of the New Testament, half of them are written by Paul. Whoa. Step back. Look at the big picture. All he did was he came alongside and he provided encouragement. And look at the size of the impact. Amazing. Look at the life he led. Amazing. What an adventure. What a fulfilling life. Hebrews 3:13 says, encourage one another daily. You see why I say I love the dailiness of this way of showing compassion. Simple things that can be done, not a big reach, but it's a matter of a mental focus and making the simple effort. That's exhort one another, encourage one another every day, okay? So we can prevent one another from being hardened by sin. Chapter 10 gives us another verse. Let us not give up meeting together, as some are in the habit of doing, but let us, encourage one another, because Christ is coming soon. So it's all about a matter of willing to come alongside. And in Hebrews 10:25, it says, do it coming together in the church. And we too can be like Barnabas, to have this mindset and decide that we can offer encouragement daily. Then you never know the results of what God can do. Going back to the ones that the Bible gave us just from Barnabas' life, and his is not everything that can be done, okay? But just to use those as examples, giving by our donations. I've known some people who are medical doctors who never got home from hospital rounds until 10:30. Well, they couldn't bring themselves around to be there. But whenever we needed their home open for a big meeting, yeah, come on ahead. My home is your home, right? It's a great way to give, and it's not just money. Or some of you can become great at knowing new people and trying to fold them in, like Barnabas did for Saul. And I especially encourage old-timers to take that responsibility for all newcomers. The problem in churches is oftentimes the old-timers stay in their old-timers group and they never cross that invisible divide to newcomers. They never get invited over to their house, and forever you have churches that are split between those who have been there since forever and those who are just trying to find a place. And so it's so simple. You have the credibility, you know the other leadership. You can make somebody who's temporary into someone who's permanent and can make a contribution like Saul did. You can support other groups and other activities that aren't your own to be alongside. You know how many meetings I go to and activities I go to where I don't understand a word of what's going on. But we're all in the same church, or we're all in the same city, or we're all in the same homeowners association, or we have the same ride-sharing charity group in our neighborhood for senior citizens and shut-ins, you see, or talking about what's going to be built near your neighborhood. So there's other that you're not primarily a part of, but you get a chance to be there for them, to encourage them and help them, even pay some dues. Anyway, some of you can be good at spotting talent. But don't just spot them. Bring them in and bring them under your wings and take care of them and put in the time and the effort and the love. And it's got to be a relational thing, okay? In ministry, it's different from work. In ministry, it's got to be relational. But you know what? I just recently read a book by the guy who has been in charge of HR. They don't call it HR for Google. Do you know why Google is consistently one of the best companies to work for? Because they treat their employees like family. They don't just say it, but they figure if these guys are putting 60 hours of their lives each week with us, we want to make their time here as beautiful as possible. And they put their money where their mouth is. So take the time to do that. And then there are those who need a second chance, who need, like John Mark, to be brought in and given another opportunity. A lot of times I see people fail the first time and we forget about them, okay? And we cut them loose. No, sometimes it takes a while to get enough background and knowledge and experience to be able to do it right, and then to be able to do it well. It takes a long time to learn a new skill. And so you need to give people second chance, third chances. We got to treat each other like we treat these little kids when they're doing the bell choir. They're not going to be playing for the Philharmonic, right? But we're going to be patient with them, and we're going to smile at them, and we're going to encourage. That's the same way we got to do for adults, because we're all people, and we all need, basically the same kind of treatment. So, what can you do? Which of these would be your specialty? Which can you add if you're already doing some of it? What are some causes, some struggles that you can partner with? I encourage us to pray for an others-oriented mentality, to think about people that we can appreciate and show encouragement to think of something that you can come alongside of and participate with. Say, again, we're talking about church. We're not talking about work. We're not talking about neighborhood. We're not even talking about family. Church is very different. And God looks on the needy. He looks on the lowly. And he says, you know what? Those of you who are capable should be serving them. Because that's the example Jesus set for us, right? And we bring our worldly point of view. Hey, I'm the top dog. You should be serving me. That doesn't work in a church. Doesn't even work if you want to be a top 5 company like Google, okay? I think of the story of Gehazi. Gehazi was a servant of Abraham. And Abraham got old, and Isaac wasn't married, and he didn't want Isaac to marry one of the Canaanite women whose customs and lifestyles were very different. So he sends his old servant, and he says, go back to the old country. Find a girl from there. And so Gehazi, in his old age, loads up the camels, and he travels all the way over there. And I don't know if he came on board from the old country or Abraham picked him up along the way, but he shows up, and he doesn't know what to do. So he goes to the center of town. Now, back in those days, that wasn't the mall. It was the village well. So he shows up at village well, and he says, well, now what do I do? He says, I know. I have been sent here by Abraham to try to do this errand for him, and I don't know what to do next. I will pray. When stuck, always pray. So he prays. He says, God, I need your help. I need you to bring a girl who's qualified and somebody that I'll know. And so he says, this is how I'll know. And boom, she shows up. And he is dumbfounded. And he is amazed, and he is so pleased. And I always remember this from my childhood, what he says in Genesis 24:27, his testimony. He says, and I learned it in the King James, and it's clear in the King James, I being in the way, the Lord led me. Okay? Meaning, I was willing to step forward, to come alongside of a situation, and the Lord led me. And that's what we see in Barnabas' life. We don't have to worry about the outcomes. We just need to be available, to come alongside. and hope to encourage. Let's pray. Dear God, thank you so much. Sometimes we make such a big deal out of things, but really it's about the heart and a little seed called willingness. A willingness to come alongside, a willingness to encourage, a willingness to leave the results to you. And sometimes the results are far, far beyond whatever we could have expected. And we are so blessed to be a part of that we can't believe it's happened to us. And yet that's what happened for Barnabas, and I've seen where this has happened for other people. So speak to us, Lord, and show us individually and personally so that we will be a body of those who come alongside, those who encourage. Help us to continue as we go through this love series, Lord, not to have a lot of information, but help us to find little by little that our hearts are changing in your direction, that we are becoming more like Jesus. All of this we ask in the name of our Lord and Savior. Amen.